Hello BookTube, I'm Jonathan, and 3 of my recent reads have been modern sci-fi books, so I'm going to give you spoiler-free reviews for each of those, and then let you know whether I think modern sci-fi is headed in the right direction. And of course, because 3 is a rather small sample size, at the end of the video, I'm going to be giving you my average ratings by decade in order to see if there is a trend, whether sci-fi is getting better or worse, or whether it's just as good as it's always been. Editing Jonathan here, and at the end of the video I will also be spinning the quantum wheel in order to find out which sci-fi book will be the patron pick for the month of May. So let's get into today's books, starting with Borne by Jeff VanderMeer. Borne takes place in a mysterious post-apocalyptic setting where our main characters Rachel and Wick try to survive on the outskirts of a city where biotech has run amok. And some of the strange characters that they encounter include a giant bear named Maud, a drug dealer named the Magician, and a sea anemone-like creature called Borne. This is the second book I've read from Jeff VanderMeer, the first being Annihilation. And something I enjoyed in Annihilation was VanderMeer's prose. I think he is a master of creating a surreal and unsettling atmosphere, and I think some of the strengths of his writing are present here in Borne as well, but I would describe this one as just a little bit more approachable, not quite as dense. At times, this book feels a little bit more like fantasy than science fiction because some of the biotech evolutions are pretty wild, and while VanderMeer does provide some explanations here and there, he doesn't go into detailed technical descriptions, so this definitely leans more towards the softer end of the sci-fi spectrum. I think that VanderMeer is a solid character writer, but I wouldn't say that's the primary strength of the book. I cared just enough about these characters to care about what happened to them and the decisions that they made, but I'm not sure I'm going to be thinking about these characters in the future. The real strength of this book is the mysterious green and purple creature, Borne. When you think about the literary history of different types of beings, such as monsters, aliens, robots, it can be quite hard to come up with something that feels unique. And yet, that is a magic trick that I think VanderMeer successfully pulled off with Borne. The mystery behind its origins and characteristics were genuinely intriguing, and Rachel's relationship to Borne was the emotional anchor in an otherwise hazy world. I was mostly positive on this book. However, I do think that Jeff VanderMeer is better at posing questions than he is at providing answers. There were 4 main threads that I was interested in seeing resolutions to in this story, and one of them I thought was very good, 2 of them I thought were pretty good, and the other is the most anticlimactic ending to a story I have ever read. Something that was built up throughout the entire novel ends in a single sentence. Like, alright, here's what you've been waiting for. There it is. Alright, let's move on. Like, no, what? I was genuinely baffled as to how VanderMeer and/or his editor thought that this was a satisfactory ending to that storyline. Anyway, despite this somewhat noticeable blemish, I did still enjoy the book. I think that if you like philosophical science fiction, cryptic world building, and dreamlike prose, then this one might hit for you. If you're in the mood for something more plot-driven or more science-driven, then it might not work as well. In the end, I gave Borne a 7 out of 10. Up next, The Windup Girl by Paolo Bacagalupi. The Windup Girl is set in the 23rd century, where climate change and widespread plagues have ravaged the Earth's food supplies. Biotech companies using gene-hacked seeds control food production, and calories are a currency. The story takes place in Thailand, and we follow 5 different perspectives, with the main characters being Anderson Lake, an Agrigent company man, and Amiko, who is a new person also known as a wind-up girl. The first thing I noticed about this book was how rich the world feels. A lot of care has been put into crafting the economic, political, and environmental factors at play. And all of the different factions have clear motivations, and there are high-stakes ramifications for each of the decisions they make. The location also feels alive because Bacagalupi's descriptions have the sights, smells, and sounds of Thailand jumping off the page. Even when the plot moves a little bit slowly, you can still enjoy the vivid setting. In regard to the characters, I found some of the characters' storylines interesting overall, but didn't overly care about them as individuals. All of the characters do end up being relevant to the story in the end, but in the middle of the book, there were some characters' chapters which, I kind of just wanted to get through and move on to the next one. I should mention this is quite a dark read. It is violent in a visceral way, and I think that's used to good effect in some of the action scenes, but there are also some scenes depicting abuse which are rather confronting. Now, I do think it is believable that in this somewhat dystopian future world that people might treat a genetically modified human in this cruel way, but I'm not sure if that level of cruelty was necessary in order to develop the character. In the end, I found this to be a satisfying narrative, perhaps with just a few small plot holes, and I loved the world and I think it had some great moments, but I'm not sure there was anything that resonated with me thematically that I'm still thinking about after having finished the book. Overall, I gave The Windup Girl a 7.5 out of 10. And for our third modern sci-fi book, Service Model by Adrian Tchaikovsky. Service Model takes place in a future where humanity is highly dependent on robots, and our main character Charles, a valet robot, sets out to find employment after an incident at his master's house. This is the fourth book I've read by Adrian Tchaikovsky, and I liked Shards of Earth and Dogs of War, and I loved Children of Time. And Service Model gets off to a great start as well with a fantastic first chapter. It quickly sets up the world, introduces us to this character Charles, and the plot gets going with a bang. But unfortunately, my enjoyment of this book went downhill rather quickly. A large chunk of this book is robots talking to other robots, and this gets really repetitive because so many of the conversations are these circular debates over logical contradictions or overly literal programming. And this is a satirical book, so perhaps that was a commentary on the rigidity of artificial intelligence versus the nuance of human intelligence, but it offered diminishing returns in terms of the humor derived from each of these miscommunications. Also, the robots were kind of dumb. I feel like ChatGPT is probably smarter than these robots were, so I found it a little bit hard to buy into this premise that these future humans were so dependent on these dumb robots. In some ways, I wish this book was even sillier and was just an outright comedy, or it took a more serious approach to robotics and AI, because as it was, neither of these aspects quite landed for me. Now, an interesting element of Tchaikovsky's writing is how he gets you to care about non-human characters. I was incredibly emotionally invested in the spiders in Children of Time and the bioengineered animal soldiers in Dogs of War. In Service Model, I did not care about the robots. You could have shut down Charles and I wouldn't have felt a thing. And this is coming from someone that felt like crying almost the entire time while reading Clara and the Sun, and did actually cry while playing the video game Detroit Become Human. Now, for some people, this detachment might actually be a good thing, because a common criticism in science fiction is that the aliens felt too human, or the artificial intelligence felt too human. So I do think it was intentional that the robots felt robotic, but does that make for a good book? Because if I have no emotional connection whatsoever to any of the characters, then the story better be pretty amazing, or include some rather eye-opening themes and concepts. But instead, in Service Model, the book is largely driven by occasionally amusing, mostly dry dialogue. For me, the skill in writing artificial intelligence is to create a character that doesn't feel human, but you still find interesting or intriguing and makes you question the nature of intelligence. Fortunately, the last 50 pages or so saved this book for me. You get some pretty big reveals, and the conversations have more thematic weight to them. I like Tchaikovsky's writing when he's philosophical and prefer his more serious and emotional work. Overall, I liked the beginning and the end, but there was a lot of plotting in between. I ended up giving Service Model a 6.5 out of 10. So those are 3 modern sci-fi books I read recently. Unfortunately, no new favorites, as I'd put all of them in the good but not great category. Is this a bad sign for modern science fiction? No, I wouldn't say so, as there are positive elements to be found in each of them. I think there were elements of Borne that were very original, the world building in The Windup Girl was vibrant, and Service Model explored some rather interesting themes towards the end. For me, it was just a matter of consistently executing all of these different elements throughout the book, which I know these modern authors are capable of. particularly Adrian Tchaikovsky with his novel Children of Time. But as I said, 3 books is a small sample size, so let's take a look at my average ratings by decade in order to see whether I think sci-fi is getting better or worse. I've included my averages from the 1950s through the 2010s, as those are the decades in which I have read over 20 plus sci-fi books, which I think is a better sample size in order to be able to compare these decades more fairly. As you can see, there's some slight movement up and down, but I don't think any of these differences are statistically significant. While you might be able to find stylistic differences between modern and classic sci-fi books, I think the average quality has remained pretty consistent over time, as I think that's down to the execution by the individual authors. And I think this not only applies to averages, but it's also true at the top end. If you take a look at my top 25 sci-fi books of all time, which there'll probably be a couple of new additions to this list now, but it's a pretty even mix of modern and classic sci-fi. In fact, there is a sci-fi book represented from every decade from the 1940s all the way through the 2020s. Personally, I think you can find great science fiction in any era. And while I might be on a little bit of a cold streak at the moment, I haven't had a 5-star read in a while, I'm sure my next great sci-fi read is just around the corner. And whether it's a classic or modern sci-fi book, we'll just have to wait and see. But the wait might not be a long one. Welcome to the Quantum Wheel, where all of the patron picks are both simultaneously picked and not picked until we observe a winner. Let's find out what I'll be reading in the month of May. Will it be modern? Will it be classic? Let's find out. The Quantum Wheel has decided I will be reading Hard to Be a God by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. Wow, okay. So I have read Roadside Picnic, which I was a pretty big fan of, and the premise for this one sounds pretty interesting too. So check it out if you're interested in reading Hard to Be a God. Join me in the month of May. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash or just gently click the subscribe button, and if you really enjoyed it, consider checking out the perks of becoming a Patreon member, where you can become one of my robots, androids, or cyborgs, like Nima, A New Eden, Half Ogre, Zakawe, Samil, and the classic Colin. And you can find more sci-fi content over here.